Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the American Museum of Tort Law. This is a very special day and a very special program. I'm Rick Newman. I'm the director here, and I do want to thank you all for coming out on this beautiful sunny day as we mourn the loss of 346 lives, as we celebrate their lives, and as we come together with a renewed sense of purpose to work for safety, for the health and well-being of everybody, to repair the world as it was. We have an interesting and, I think, powerful program today with a number of notable guests. Senator Blumenthal will be here momentarily and will be speaking to us. Noted consumer air advocate Bill McGee will be here speaking. Joan Claybrook, past president of Public Citizen, is here to speak. Ralph Nader, and of course Nadia Milleron and Michael Stumo, parents of Samya Rose Stumo. Before the senator speaks, I wanted to show a short movie about Samya. You can play that, please.
In the early morning hours of March 10th, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed after only 6 minutes in the air. On board was Samya Rose Stumo, a beloved daughter, sister, friend, partner, and also an emerging leader in the field of global health. She was en route to Nairobi, Kenya, as part of a new job, working to bring universal health coverage to Kenya and Uganda, and also working to make the world a better place.
We are creating the Samya Stumo Fellowship, a 1-year in-depth global health experience for 2 young women who are emerging leaders in healthcare development and who face financial barriers. This fellowship will provide an opportunity for research and development of healthcare systems internationally. It will also offer the skills for speaking truth to power on behalf of marginalized groups. This way, Samya's presence will be multiplied.
Samya started her career when she was still 16 years old. She went to the Andean Altiplano in Peru, and she did research on different ways how to help pregnant women achieve better health care there. After finishing her bachelor's degree in anthropology and Spanish, she went on to do her master's degree in global health at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And her master thesis focused on the disparities between hepatitis policy and patient experience in Europe.
Samya was a visionary. She promised to ease suffering and save lives of people around the world. This fellowship is how Samya's voice will continue to ring loud and her spirit to shine bright on a better future. Help us support future women to achieve great things in global health.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I would like to welcome our senior senator from the state of Connecticut, Senator Richard Blumenthal. He is serving, in a sense, as our trustee in the fight to strengthen the FAA to make it the regulatory oversight body that it should be. And without further ado, I welcome Senator Dick Blumenthal.
I am honored to be here today and inspired, as I always am, to be in the presence of this remarkable family, to Ralph and Laura, whom I've known for a long time, and to all of the Nader family, and of course to Michael and Nadia. We're here today to honor and remember a wonderful young person whose future lay ahead of her. Samya Stumo was one of 346 who perished tragically and senselessly As a result of a deeply flawed design and manufacture and a failure of our government to properly oversee and protect people who fly on its airplane. We're here to honor her, and the best way to honor her is the way that many of us here have reacted in the past to similar kinds of tragedies, to honor with action, to make sure that this death is not in vain, to make sure that Samya's memory is one of changing the system to save others, as I feel she would want us to do. We're here in a place that is a monument to making the law work as a result of a man who has made the law and changed the law for the better of millions of Americans' lives. Thank you, Ralph Nader, for all you have done for America over so many years. And on a personal note, as he knows, because I've told him, he has been a model for me, not only as a public official, but as a trial lawyer, and now as a legislator. The simple fact of the matter is that the MAX 737 had no business flying. It was revised in a way that changed its engine placement, its fundamental software and other designs, its single sensor reliance, other kinds of deeply rooted flaws in how Boeing designed and manufactured that plane. And those flaws were made particularly catastrophic by its failure to prepare and train pilots who would have to deal with the catastrophes that lay ahead if they didn't understand those flaws and the potential impact of them. But the failures of Boeing are not the only cause here. The FAA bears equal or perhaps greater responsibility because it was supposed to certify that plane for airworthiness, for trustworthiness, for safety and reliability. That's its mission, that's its function, that's its job. It failed. And it failed in part because of systemic issues. Failures that were allowed to persist for literally more than a decade, almost 2 decades. The FAA, in effect, delegated its responsibility for certifying aircraft. It delegated that responsibility to the manufacturers, like Boeing. It allowed Boeing to do that certification with its own employees, people who were hired and fired, supervised, and paid by Boeing to look at Boeing's own products and to say whether they are safe. In effect, the FAA put the fox in charge of the hen house. It tried to do safety on the cheap, which is neither cheap nor safe. And so I am dedicated to making sure that the system is changed. I'm working with colleagues like Ed Markey on legislation, and Ralph has been an extraordinary advisor in this process, calling attention to new facts and potential changes and reforms. And to take politics out of this process, you know, Boeing delayed, and so did the FAA, grounding these planes so that we were one of the last countries to force their non-use. That's a sign of unconscionable political interference. And it's a symptom of a larger problem. We have a duty to honor these 346 deaths with action, and Samya's in particular. I apologize for talking about issues that seem unconnected to a vibrant, wonderful, passionate life, ended all too soon, a life that has inspired us, but making America safer, making air travel safer, making the world safer, I think is an appropriate step that we can take. And so I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to share these thoughts with you today. My heart and prayers, my families, go out to Michael and Nadia and all of the Stumo and Nader families. But more than thoughts and prayers, I'm determined that there be action. And I will fight as hard as I can, as long and hard as possible, to make sure that we do act and make America safer. Thank you so much for having me today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Ralph Nader. He has, for half a century, been the foremost consumer safety advocate fighting for the health and well-being and safety of all of us that America has produced. He is a towering figure in our national life. And so it is my great honor and great pleasure to introduce Ralph Nader.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Thanks, Senator Blumenthal, for his sensitive and action-oriented remarks. Thank you all for coming. We are gathered here at the American Museum of Tort Law on a solemn occasion. The Boeing Corporation took the lives of Samya Rose Stumo and 155 other passengers and crew on Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. Prior to that, for the same causes, nearly 200 people were killed in the Lions Air crash in the Java Sea off Indonesia. Our agonizing bereavement needs both spiritual solace and the contribution that Senator Blumenthal spoke about to make sure this never happens again. These are not unsubstantiated comments. We're dealing here with corporate crime. This is a premeditated attempt to cut corners, save Boeing profits, catch up with Boeing's competitor, Airbus 320 Neo, and override the judgment of Boeing's own safety engineers by Boeing executives. From that decision to design a defectively unstable aircraft, which we'll hear about more soon, proceeded step after step of criminally negligent actions, all the way through the software, to the failure to train, the failure to warn, the failure to report, the cover-ups. which is why the Justice Department has opened a criminal probe into the Boeing situation with an operating grand jury, which is why the bereaved families have filed a suit in tort law against the Boeing corporations in federal district court in Chicago. We hold this commemoration and resolve to action because of this horrific disaster and its causes, which were preventable and must not be allowed to repeat. The rule of law must be invoked to assure justice for the deceased and the next of kin, and explicitly signal strong deterrence to those who would be tempted to place material profits, short-term gains, over the supremacy of life and safety. Can we do anything less for our beloved Samya and all the other passengers on those planes and their families? Can we do anything less for her compassionate, attentive, and life-saving initiatives that she wanted to lead over the next 50 years for this tormented world? We'll never know how many lives she would have saved, but they would have been many. And that's why we want the legislation that Senator Blumenthal is preparing to be passed, and another bill he wants to make sure that for willful and knowing violations by corporations, in every federal law there'll be a criminal penalty and not just civil punishment. Something the corporations have been persisting in advancing their own immunity from the criminal laws to which all other human beings are exposed to when they behave in similar manner. I'd like to introduce the parents of Samya Rose Stumo, Nadia Milleron, and Michael Stumo. And they also speak on behalf of their two sons, Adnan and Tort, who are not here at the present time. This is a family has risen to the occasion, like other families of similar tragedies, to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. They want to make sure that this plane, multiplied 5,000 times, which is how many orders are pending, carrying hundreds of millions of passengers, will not be allowed to fly and be prone to stalling, where the software overcomes control of the plane from the very pilots that the passengers are trusting to take off and land safely. They have been in Washington, D.C. They have met with the FAA chief for 2 hours. They've met with the National Transportation Safety Board. They've met with members of Congress. Their grief will never go away, but it's partially endurable by taking a lead on behalf of all of us who flying the planes, to make sure that the deterioration state of deregulation and corporate overreach do not plague the safety of hundreds of millions of future airline passengers. Thank you.
We're grateful that you all came here today. We miss Samya every day, every minute. I'm wearing her earrings, I'm wearing her skirt, I'm wearing a blouse that she gave me last August for my birthday. The only way that we can go forward is to try to hope that changes are made so that the FAA, when they certify airplanes, they're actually safe. And all these people here, this isn't even half of the people who died. This is only 89. the people who died out of the 346 people. All of these people believed that if an airplane is certified to go on a commercial flight, that it would be safe. And that wasn't true. And we can't pretend that the FAA has the systems in place to do this. We have to make a change. So I'm going to read from Samya's undergraduate thesis, and at the end I'm going to read from her graduate thesis, because the words are about maternal child care, and also the words in her graduate thesis are about hepatitis, but they actually apply to this situation. She says, "It would be simple to chalk up the difficulties and failures in health and healthcare to an explicit desire on the part of an overbearing Peruvian government to control all of its people. This is not the reality. In practice, all of the involved factors converge in dysfunction. This makes the situation both better in that no one is an inherently evil person out to cause pain and suffering, and also more complicated to resolve. However, for anything to begin to be resolved, we must first face the overarching disconnects between those who have the power to make decisions and the populations who are affected by those decisions and their different implementations on the local level. Only then can we solve the problem. And you can just put in the federal government and Boeing instead of the Peruvian government, and you see that in this case also, all of the involved factors converged in dysfunction. Now, Samya believed that human beings are good, and she was raised in the Orthodox Christian tradition. And her church, you should visit sometime, is over on Twin Lakes in Salisbury, Connecticut. And what she learned in her spiritual education, her moral education, led her to want to do right for all human beings. And we're continuing that now by our behavior. This is the only thing we have from Ethiopia. It's a stone cross. Ethiopia is an Orthodox Christian country, so we did feel comfortable there. The crash happened at the beginning of Lent, and we were comforted by the fact that it was a somber time, and there were services every day. People came up to us, and they grabbed our hands, and they bent their heads, and they cried. People who didn't know us and didn't know Samya. That's how strong the spiritual tradition is there. It's something Samya was very interested in. So you have to look at how a person is nurtured in their heart and in their soul in order to see what fuels them to do right in this world. And this cross and the realities around this tradition, they fuel us, they continue to fuel us. So when we go to Washington, we've been twice. We've been to 2 different hearings for the House of Representatives. And we go to the offices of the committee members for the aviation subcommittee for both the House and the Senate. And we bring this poster both to the hearing and to the offices. And the poster started out only with 11 people on it. And now we have 89, and we're going to continue to look for the pictures and stories of the people who died with Samya. These are the people that she talked to, that she sat next to. She was in seat 16J. Many of them, there are 35 different countries involved. Many of these people don't speak English. We have a responsibility to help them be heard in our government. This was an American company. So I want you all to know of the few people that I know here. When we went to the FAA and met with Chairman Elwell, Daniel Elwell, we were accompanied by Paul Njoroge. Paul lost his entire family. He's a Canadian resident. He's a financial analyst, a very intelligent person. He knew about the Indonesian crash, but on his itinerary, as many itineraries, the equipment that his family would fly on was not listed. And he feels that if he had seen the 737 MAX 8 on the itinerary, bells would have gone off on his head. He was aware of the impact of that crash and the status of the plane that was potentially an unsafe plane. So he would have probably routed his family through Frankfurt, and they would have flown on a different, a larger plane. So this is his son, Ryan. This is Paul's daughter, Kelly. She's an American citizen. This is Paul's daughter, Ruby. She's a Canadian citizen. This is Paul's wife, Carolyn, who never dated anyone else. They met in university. This is Paul's mother-in-law, Anne. Paul's whole family was wiped out. Along with Samya, other 24-year-olds died. There were 3 in particular that were environmental activists in Canada. They were so amazing in their focus and their successful action that they were recognized by the UN and given a grant by the Canadian government to go to the UN Conference on the Environment in Nairobi. So these were Danielle, who's next to Samya, but they didn't know each other. Danielle's mother and I like to think that maybe our daughters exchanged a word or helped each other out. This is Angela Ruhorn, Danielle Moore, Micah Messent. All of them are the same age. These 3 knew each other. They went to college together. We also met Paweł Konarski, who is from Poland. He worked for Qatar Airlines, and his wife, Stella, also worked for Qatar Airlines. They have a little boy, Adam. Paweł is so proud of Adam that even though he was just 1.5, he looks like he's 3, said. So there's another picture of Adam. There are 2 brothers. I've been in touch with the widow of one of them, the Rifle brothers, Melvin and Bennett from Redding, California. They were on a last adventure before Melvin's wife would have a baby, Aunt Emma, which now she has had. That family is not able to come to Washington, D.C. The parents of Melvin and Bennett are helping Brittany take care of Emma. So this is Marcelino Tayob. He is from Mozambique. This is the first family that we met in Ethiopia that had also lost somebody on the plane. Marcelino worked for the UN for 20 years. He was an important advocate from Mozambique. You know, the US government should take responsibility in including all of the family members in these discussions. We have a heightened awareness that the FAA did not protect our loved ones. It's really important to include these pictures, not as a kind of protest at the hearing with us sitting in the front row with the pictures, but the government itself should include them with a slideshow or putting the pictures up in the hearing room. It's difficult for us to find these people because even if you know the name and the country, their family probably doesn't live in the same place that they are because they're adults. So along those lines, we received an email from Oliver Vick's family, another email from Sam Pegram's family. They're from the UK, and you know we haven't gotten a chance to ask them about their son's lives and the contributions they make. You can see that we're just struggling to kind of get all of these people and recognize them. This is a picture of the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines at the crash site right after the crash. This is a piece of metal. Do you see a plane here? There's no plane. The plane is under the ground. This is all that he saw right after the crash. We didn't even understand that. When we went to the crash site right afterwards, already the bulldozers had been digging up things. There was like piles of clothing and piles of plane debris, and we didn't understand that those things were not on top of the ground when the crash happened. They were inside the ground. They were dug up. It was hard for us to understand that all of these people were just broken into little pieces and mixed with the earth. None of us have received remains for our loved ones as of yet, although The Ethiopian government is telling us that maybe after 6 months. This is an aerial picture of the crash where you can see that, this is right after the crash happened. So you can see that the hole in the earth is just the size of an airplane. So the software in the plane didn't measure where the ground was. Don't you think that's like a huge problem? Like the software could measure the altitude, but this place, Addis, is 8,000 feet altitude. So according to the software, the plane had enough room to dive down, but there wasn't enough room because the ground was there. The pilots knew that. 2 adult male pilots pulled back on the stick and could not move it because it was designed that the software would override the pilots. These are such basic concepts. Where is the ground? That could go through the FAA and not be caught? That's crazy. That means that our FAA does not have the systems, the expertise, the oversight to actually keep us safe. You guys all have to speak up about that. You all, why? I think you do. So we've kind of been sharing, Mike and I have been sharing when we go to representatives and senators' office, we've been sharing the explanation of this, what needs to be done. And so I'm going to switch with him now and give him the microphone. I'm going to hold the poster.
So we were at the first hearing. We had many fewer pictures that we showed. We were at the second hearing, and we again held this poster. We held this poster with the silhouettes that represent all the victims of each crash, but we don't have all their names. A lot of people can't participate, as Nadia said. They can't emotionally do it. They can't financially do it. They don't have the understanding. And Nadia's spending a lot of time trying to get them involved as best as they can. We were in DC at the hearing this week. 3 of Samya's friends were there with us holding the posters. If you've seen the pictures, they were Samya's dear friends. And we went to 27 different offices this week with all the aviation committees. We're asking them to include the families. We're asking them to not unground this plane, not make any decision until all the investigations are in. I was at the FAA early on before we met with Acting Administrator Elwell, and they said, we have the blue chip investigation, blue ribbon task force that was appointed by Secretary of Transportation Chow, who oversees the FAA. We have a technical advisory board. We have a joint task force among international aviation authorities. We know that there's a Inspector General report investigation going on where many agencies have an Inspector General that investigates the agency itself. There's, of course, the Department of Justice criminal probe. The House Transportation Committee has an investigation. The Senate Transportation Committee has an investigation. They said we will leave no stone unturned. And I said, okay, so that's great. It's wonderful. What's the process if you start ungrounding the plane? They said, well, with Boeing, we'll submit a software update and we will analyze whether it's good, and then that will be our decision. I said, well, don't you want to wait till all the investigations are done? And they didn't have anything to say. And while we do know that when we were there, there was a proposal for some more pilot training because the pilots' lack of knowledge of this system and lack of practicing with it, lack of muscle memory to deal with it when stick shaking happened and the plane starts diving for unexplained reasons and there's alerts going off and startling things happening, and they're supposed to remember one of 27 checklists on the fly that's in a very thick manual in a very square black briefcase that they carry around with them to these planes. The proposed FAA training was to give them a couple hours of iPad training. And usually the comment period is for 30 days, and it was shortened to 14 days. So we it's too quick. We knew something was up. And so I said to them, we as families have just gotten off floor. Most of them haven't. We've drug ourselves to Washington. This doesn't seem reasonable for you to have a 14-day period. It's usually 30 days, and plus iPad training doesn't seem like it makes any sense. Will you open the period to 30 days? And here's a letter from us and other families asking you to do it. And they looked at each other and said, well, maybe we can. And they ultimately did it. But the thing is, the inertia of the past 20 years or so is to keep reducing pilot training, to keep reducing safety, to allow more free reign of Boeing with their timelines and their time pressures, to ignore the safety engineers, to fire them, to quash them, to sideline the FAA, to boost shareholder value under former CEO McNerney and under current CEO Muhlenberg, to spend billions of dollars on stock buybacks to pump up their own stock, to pump up the value of the stock options of the executives, including Muhlenberg, to justify his raises, the only turning in a critical public safety company into an investment company. If they want to focus only on shareholder returns, they can go to Google and Amazon and do it there. They shouldn't do it with Boeing. The National Transportation, we have seen reports by the National Transportation and Safety Board from the past 10 years that have discussed how you engineer these planes to be resistant to human error. There's hundreds and thousands of them up in the air any day or week, to be resistant to pilot error, not to startle them and to cause pilot error, not to startle them and to cause pilots to be the last step before a crash, to keep these planes safe. And the NTSB has already written these reports. The Inspector General at the FAA has already written a report on how their current certification system isn't working. It doesn't correctly identify safety factors. We already had this knowledge. It was ignored. The only leverage we have now is to keep this plane on the ground until everything is fixed. Because once that plane is up in the air, any corrections of safety will just be ignored. They'll say it's a good point. Thank you very much. We'll consider it very seriously. That's why we got up. That's why Ralph was urging us and has been helping us in many different ways to get a very deep analysis, a very deep understanding, and convey them to those who are doing the investigations, and to do it now, because this is a time in history. They haven't done it in the crash of 2009 in Buffalo. They didn't do it for the Lion Air crash. They didn't pay any attention to near misses and pilot reports of problems with this plane that were coming. They just say, we've been safe for 10 years without a crash. But you had lots of data with near misses and complaints that would lead you in another industry like medical devices to intervene before someone dies. This is a particular point in time where we can correct the system. The knowledge is there. And we've got to keep this plane on the ground until all the reports are in and we have a comprehensive fix at the FAA and legislatively. And that's what we hope you'll help us do, and that the attention that we're bringing to the case, we don't want to be out front on this. We want to do something else. We have to do this.
I'm just going to finish with Samya's words from her graduate thesis. It's on hepatitis, so it's pretty technical, but at the end she says, there's no excuse for inaction by policymakers, planners, and payers in the face of this major public health threat. And in fact, dangerous planes are a major public health threat. So her words are exactly on point. Now, Samya was a problem solver. She wanted healthcare to be available to every human being all over the world. And she was a can-do person. She believed that she could help make that happen and be part of a whole system to make that happen. And she was super practical, and she looked for ways for people to cooperate and have social interaction that would make them feel congenial with each other, and then help them to cooperate on these problems. So we hope you remember her in that spirit and love each other and work for necessary change. Thank you.
In all the annals of grief by grief-stricken people, I think we all agree that Nadia and Mike are trying to uphold the standards of constructive remedy for future safety. I think if families in all kinds of tragedies organized at that level, we'd have a lot more action, because they have great moral power before lawmakers, and the door's open for families that are not open for other people. And it's a good continuing lesson that whenever families organize, they're often called victims' families, they really get something done. And where they don't or unable to organize, then the lawmakers listen to the lobbyists and take their campaign contributions and drag their feet. And the same problem happens again and again. So thank you very much, Nadia and Mike. We've all received lots of condolence letters, and we want to thank everybody who sent them. But there's one in particular that we think is very memorable for its brief content, and I want to have my sister, Dr. Claire Nader, come up and just read it by way of thanking all the people who sent their condolences.
This is a condolence that was sent to Ralph shortly after the crash by Edgar Kahn and his family. Edgar Kahn is a longtime colleague of Ralph's and good friend and a lawyer. And what he said throws the issue forward. Every life is precious, but there are some who have the gift and commitment to transform the present and create new possibilities. We have read what you have shared about Samya, that you describe her as having leadership, compassion, and intellectual rigor, and you shared that her life's commitment was to global health and prevention. She was surely the kind of person that the world needs now more than ever. Throwing forward, his words are, "There is no replacing or repairing your unimaginable loss, but we join you in affirming her values, her commitment, and her dreams of contributing to a better world. Even as you continue your lifelong work to unmask, confront, and expose the pathological obsession with the reckless pursuit of wealth and power that leads so-called leaders of industry to characterize such casualties as no more than unfortunate accidents and externalities. External to what? To life? To meaning? To purpose? These are the things for which Nadia so clearly stood. And following up from his words, I invite all of you, pardon? What did I say? Samya so clearly stood like mother, like daughter, like daughter, like mother. I invite all of you to participate. All of you can take some action as a result of what you're hearing today, in your own words, in your own way, but take an action, because we all fly and we all should care about each other's safety. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. People often ask, what is a tort? And torts are everywhere. Torts are where bullies are, where bad corporations are, where bad hospitals are, where people who are thoughtless and negligent are. So they're everywhere. And I want to introduce Joan Claybrook, who for many decades has worked to prevent torts in the motor vehicle area, responsible for recalling millions of cars as the administrator of the National Highway Safety Agency under President Carter, and for her continuing this work as president of Public Citizen. She has been indefatigable in going after the auto companies to such an intense degree that they nicknamed her the Dragon Lady. And she's never stopped because she's driven by compassion and knowledge, and above all, persistence. When they see her walking down the corridors in Congress, they know what's coming. And so she exemplifies the public citizen. And she's here today because something she's done that we think was extraordinary. And she just met Samya once. When I said to Samya, we're going to go to dinner at Joan Claybrook's house, Samya said, "Oh, she's my hero." And she just met Samya once, and she's going to describe what happened and what she did. Joan Claybrook.
Now Ralph makes me cry when he says that. Dragon ladies cry. Actually, I have dragons all over my house. I'm very proud of that. So I did kick the auto. I did kick the auto industry around, and it was my pleasure. Okay. So I did meet Samya just once at my house. Actually, I met her twice. I made a delivery to you, to Ralph and Claire, and she answered the door. But she came to my house for dinner, and I went in to get things ready for us to eat. And the next thing I know, there was Samya. And I said, "Oh, that's all right." She said, No, I've got to help you. And she was there helping me with everything. And we had dinner much earlier than I usually do because of Samya's help. And she was just so full of life and energy and fun, joy. I've never seen a more joyful person in my life. And I have to tell you, the thing that was really amazing was that after dinner, it had snowed. And I guess that Samya knew something about snow, which we don't have very often in Washington, D.C., so people are kind of unfamiliar with how to deal with it. And some of my friends were leaving the dinner, and their car got stuck in the snow. And Samya had on the most beautiful pair of red suede shoes that were just beautiful. She jumps out of the car. She starts using her hands and getting the snow out of the way of the tire. And she digs the car out personally with her hands so that the car could move. And I thought that was just unbelievable. Most people would just sit there and look. She was right there in the middle of the snow. Well, part of the reason I think that I'm invited here today is because I'm a former regulator. I regulated the auto industry for 4 years in the Department of Transportation. And it was at a time, a very critical time, when cars were sort of switching, or were able to switch because of new technology, from killers to lifesavers. And I know that you have to be an independent decision maker. You have to have expertise. You have to hire expertise if you don't have it yourself. You have to listen to all the voices. You have to consider all the consequences of the decisions you make. And you have to understand the industry that you're dealing with. And you have to have consumer advocates and others there to balance the scales of the issues that are before the agency. So it was I had worked on regulatory issues, but I had never been the decision maker. Industry spends enormous, endless amounts of time and money to influence the regulators. Anything that they can do to affect what the decision maker thinks. Well, I have one story I have to tell you. This is in the auto safety field. So we were considering issuing a rule to require airbags in cars. And General Motors called up and said they wanted to show Brock Adams, the Secretary of Transportation, how airbags really worked. And they were going to bring a car in that had airbags installed in them. And they wanted Brock Adams, the Secretary, and myself to sit in the car and to understand how the airbag came out. Well, it's not really the way it does in a crash. In a crash, you can't hear the boom that it sounds when it's sitting still. And it's very, very quick, so you really don't even get to see much of anything. But anyway, as we were walking down toward the car, one of the engineers at my agency came up and said, "Joan, sit in the driver's seat, because the cover on the airbag in the passenger side is an old-fashioned one, and it's very heavy, and it could come off and give you a black and blue mark on your leg." We were wearing dresses at the time. And I thought, oh, okay. So without thinking a second thought, I moved myself into the driver's seat. The Secretary of Transportation sits in the passenger seat. They set off the airbag. And then when the Secretary, he's the final decision maker, when he gets to go out, he's limping. And I thought, oh my God, what did I do? I should have taken the hit, you know. Well, what I didn't realize until a day or two later, it hit him in the crotch. Well, this was, of course, even worse. And so the next thing I know is he is suggesting that we not issue the rule at all. And this was an old-fashioned one. This isn't the one that they're going to be made if we issue this rule. And he said we should have mandatory seatbelt use laws, which we didn't have authority to do. That's a state function, not a federal function. So I had to write him the meanest memo I think I've ever written to a federal, boss or boss anyplace, and say, you don't have authority to do this, we can't do it, doesn't work as well, blah, 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 blah. And of course, the rule was finally issued, as Ralph said, a little bit later than Ralph wanted, and so Ralph got very mad. But nevertheless, we issued the rule for. But it showed what the industry knew and understood, which was that it was going to affect the decision maker. And that's just one simple little tiny example of what they do day in and day out to try and affect decision makers. So Boeing and the airline industry, as you know and you've heard already today, have emasculated the FAA. They have just one step at a time, they've removed the authority in one way or another from the FAA to be a real regulator, because they have said, well, you don't need to do this, we'll take care of it, we'll supply this expertise, you don't need to worry about it. And the FAA, either because it's been lazy or because it hasn't wanted to bother or because it maybe agreed, they've let that happen. And so this is not a regulator anymore. The FAA is not a regulator anymore. And it's become so reliant on the airlines. So we know, and everyone knows, that this is the case. But we really haven't gotten to the point, despite all the incredible work that Samya's family has done and her parents. Unbelievable work. That the FAA has to reassert its authority and control, and it's the Congress. It's the Congress that's got to make them do that, to make them be the real certifiers of these aircraft before they're allowed to fly, and before this one, the MAX 8, is allowed to fly again. The relation of the American Museum of Tort Law, where we are today, to this is that tort law is a citizen initiative. And of course, the Samya's family have filed a lawsuit and taken that initiative, one of many initiatives that they've taken. But it's much less dependent on the decision makers in the government. The only decision makers really are the people who are the jury. And that's why juries are so incredibly important, because they're not influenced, nor are they allowed to be influenced by the industry. It's a crime to do that. It should be a crime to do that in the federal government as well. But it's a crime to try and influence the jury, for the defendant to try and influence the jury. And so the only decision maker is the judge, and that's why there's so many fights today, and you probably read about them occasionally in the newspaper, about who are going to be the judges, because who are the judges are really, really critical to this independent capacity of citizens to raise a stink when they've been harmed. And of course, the purpose is not only to recover some compensation for having been harmed, but also to prevent future harm from occurring. Because if a company is stung by being and penalized by having caused this harm to one family or a series of families, then it's less likely to take that risk again. It's not unknown to those of us who have been watching and being so concerned about this particular case that Boeing moved its headquarters from Washington State to Illinois about 6 years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago. In the state of Washington, where they were headquartered, punitive damages are permitted. And in the state of Illinois, where they moved, they are not. So Boeing knew what it was doing. It always knows what these companies study and research. They know what they're doing. And there are ways of getting around it, but that is clearly why they did it. And the other reason that it's so important in this particular area of the airline industry is that when these crashes occur, as Nadia has explained, no one survives. No one survives. So there are no damages that are given to the family or very few, very, very minimal, for pain and suffering. If you have someone who's injured, who's a quadriplegic, pain and suffering is a huge award, a huge piece of whatever compensation you get. But where it's where they're killed in the crash, it's very small. And so without having punitive damages, it's very, very, it's much less penalizing to the industry at large. So that's a key issue for the future, is not to allow a state to have no punitive damages. That could be a federal law. When Ralph told me about the loss of Samya after my wonderful interactions with her at my house for dinner, which I just adored, early in the morning of March 11th, I called Merrill Lynch, which is where I have my IRA, my retirement money. In 2016, they had recommended, the lady there who helps me, had recommended that I invest in Boeing. And I invested $35,000 as my IRA at that time. And on March 11th, 2019, a mere 3 years later, the profit, just the profit, was $100,000. That's just amazing. I mean, who could make $100,000 on $35,000 in 3 years? It just shows that this company was not putting money into the airplane and into flying. It was putting the money into profit, of course, from which the members of that executive board and others profited as well. I was totally shocked, but I immediately decided to sell this blood money stock and to donate it to this museum, because I could never keep such money. And that's just a small thing to do when, I mean, could I use the money? Of course. But do I want that money? No, not at all. So I'm so happy that I was able to give it to something that I thought Samya's family cared about and that was relevant to this whole horrible experience. And it also shows the fact that they're making such money, why they did not want to have this plane recertified. Because by avoiding recertification of this plane since 1967, right? Since 1967, it has not been recertified. And yet it's gone through massive changes. And they didn't want it recertified because they wanted to compete with the Airbus, and they didn't want to pay the cost. So by avoiding that kind of recertification, that's how they were able to make these humongous profits. And as Ralph said, criminally. The actions, I would just like to comment briefly and finish, that the actions of Nadia and Michael are totally amazing. While deeply mourning Samya, they have the courage to go to Washington, D.C., and to meet with these agency officials, some of whom were not so welcoming, believe me. And they said they've been to 27 congressional offices. That's just unbelievable. the energy it takes to do that, you cannot imagine. These are long corridors, different buildings. Just to get there to these offices is hard, and then you have to wait. And sometimes you just see staff people. Sometimes you see members of Congress, or you see senators. But you're there to try and make sure they really understand what's going on here. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. And you know that some of your work is going to be futile. And you know, it's just overwhelming. That's all that I can say. I've done it most of my life. I'm a professional lobbyist. I love to lobby. I love to educate members of Congress. I love to bring them along. I love to fight with them. I do it all the time. And I had one experience where, where I went to see a member of the House who was very important. It was when I was the administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And he said, look, I'm okay on motorcycle helmets, and I'm okay on speed limits, but don't talk to me about airbags. And I said, well, I'm here to talk to you about airbags. That's why I'm actually here. And he said, well, you know, I have epilepsy, and it came into the conversation about health. And I said, well, you know, how did you get to be an epileptic? And he said, oh, I was in a pickup truck crash when I was 16. And I said, and if that pickup truck had an airbag, you wouldn't be an epileptic. Do you know that? And he said, oh my God, no, I didn't know that. I said, so don't be ignorant, be informed, and go around and get your colleagues to support airbags. And it was amazing. He did do that. I mean, it was an amazing when you have a personal experience and a personal relationship with these members of Congress. If you can find that in the course of your conversation, it completely changes their point of view, even though they're rabidly against you when you start. So never give up. Never give up on any of them. It will happen. And I guess at the last thing I'd like to just tell a little story about consumer advocates and how important they are to the legislative process. I was working on a piece of legislation on rollover, motor vehicle rollover, how rollover occurs, and it's deadly crash. Even though it's slower often than others, it destroys your brain. That's what it does. And if it doesn't kill you. And these families came in and worked so hard to help pass legislation that would require the Department of Transportation to issue rollover prevention standards, so the vehicle wouldn't roll over. And you remember these SUVs, which used to be quite high up, they had a high center of gravity. They were prone to roll over. They were designed to roll over, just like the Max 8 was designed to fail. And so they came. It was incredibly hard for them. And I know how hard it is for you both. I just know it. It's so strenuous. It's a strenuous kind of work. And anyway, we got it passed. We got the rule issued. And today, 7,000 people's lives are saved every single year because of the rollover reduction from these standards. You can see I have a little emotion about these issues, for which I'm not apologetic at all. But I just want to say this is a really important event. It's an important event for you to understand that the work that the Nader family is doing makes a huge difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. Joan actually made it possible for Samya, who loved the museum, to be a double founder of the museum posthumously. And her name will be up on the next iteration of the board, along with other founders. Thank you very much, Joan. Do you know how many lawyers would have done what Joan did on March 11th? You're right. None. Thank you very much, Joan. The Boeing 737 MAX design resulted in a mass killer tort. That's what it is. It's a mass killer tort. And our next speaker, William J. McGee, has spent a lifetime trying to prevent individual mass killer torts by aircrafts and aircraft manufacturers and airlines. He's an award-winning journalist for Consumer Reports, the former editor of the Consumer Reports travel letter, which some of you may receive. In 2010, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation chose him as the lone consumer advocate on the Future of Aviation Advisory Committee. Imagine, they just have one seat for consumers, and the whole purpose of the advisory committee is to protect consumers. All the rest are filled by industry people and others who have a vested interest in the industry. He also writes a monthly travel column for USA Today. So you can see it on usatoday.com, and has contributed to other publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Money Magazine, Parents Magazine, Good Housekeeping, and many other newspapers and magazines, websites, and blogs. Before he became a journalist, he spent nearly 7 years in airline flight operations management. He's an FAA-licensed aircraft dispatcher and served in the U.S. Air Force Auxiliary. He earned an MFA from Columbia University, teaches creative writing at Hofstra University, and lives in our home state of Connecticut here. And those of you who are interested in protecting the safety of the skies, this is the book to read. It's by Bill McGee. It's extremely readable, and it's called Attention All Passengers, the Airline's Dangerous Descent and How to Reclaim Our Lives. And for those who say that the airlines had a great safety record in the last 10 years, they're right. But what's happening is that in order to save money, Boeing is pushing more and more automation into these planes, and more automation compromises pilot judgment at critical times, begins to replace pilot judgment, and begins to overpower pilot judgment. And pretty soon the airlines see this as a way to hire less experienced pilots and pay them less, because the plane is more and more automated, and you have a vicious circle. So I wouldn't bank on the last 10 years of safety record continuing in the future, while the FAA is a delegator to Boeing of its responsibilities rather than a regulator. And as Joan said, it goes back to our Congress, our senators, our representatives, our 535 people, to beef up the FAA, get its talent skills restored, its budget adequate, and to make sure that it has powerful sanctions, civil sanctions and criminal sanctions. There is no criminal penalty in the FAA statute. No matter how willful, reckless an aircraft company is, there's no criminal penalty in that statute. There are some other criminal penalties in other federal statutes, but not directly. And that does not get the attention of airline executives. When there's no criminal penalty, they can think everything that law enforcement hits them with is just the cost of doing business. And they can write it off, charge it to the insurer, or deduct it on their tax return. So Bill will be outside after the event. You want to chat with him, give him your airline passenger complaints, buy this book, which he'll be happy to autograph, and spread the word. The whole idea here of the bookstore and everything is to spread the word and get more and more education of the public, because that's really the final safeguard, isn't it? It's an informed, active citizenry. Bill McGee.
If I truly am going to hear everyone's airline complaints, this will be the first two-day event, I'm sure, in the history of the museum. Thank you. I'd like to offer my deepest sympathies to Nadia and Michael, as well as to Ralph and the entire family. And I'd like to thank everyone at the American Museum of Tort Law. I'm honored and humbled to have been asked to speak today. And I join Senator Blumenthal in pledging to assist however I can in finding new solutions for a broken system. We're here because, once again, the new normal in America is that corporations dictate to government which regulations they will and will not adhere to. And once again, many government legislators and regulators have abdicated their solemn responsibilities to protect all of us. There's a word that's become very popular in Washington in recent years. Congress and government agencies refer to meetings with stakeholders. It's a loose enough term that it's never been fully defined, but it effectively determines who gets to sit at the table when the important discussions are taking place, when the laws are being written and the regulations are being hammered out. Congressional hearings, regulatory discussions, White House meetings. The stakeholders sometimes, but not always, include labor representatives, and sometimes, but rarely, include consumer advocates. But the stakeholders always, always include the corporations that theoretically are being regulated, but all too often regulate themselves, as we've seen in recent months with Boeing. The overwhelming avalanche of lobbying money corporations pay to both major political parties effectively buy those seats at those tables. In the case of commercial aviation, the term stakeholder specifically refers to major airlines and to aircraft manufacturers such as Boeing, and sometimes the companies to which they subcontract. This means that airline passengers and the advocates who represent them are often locked out of the conversations that determine how they will be treated. Conversations about passenger rights, industry consolidation, airfares and fees, security, and most critically of all, aviation safety. As Ralph noted, in 2010, President Obama's first Secretary of Transportation asked me to serve as the consumer advocate on the DOT's Future of Aviation Advisory Committee. I was honored to do so. That was the good news. The bad news was that I was the only consumer advocate on a 19-person committee, heavily weighted to the interests of the airline industry. At that committee, I formally proposed two key initiatives concerning critical safety issues. One called for greater oversight of outsourced aircraft maintenance by U.S. airlines, and the other called for mandating that children under 2 be properly seated in approved safety restraints on board commercial flights. In both cases, the DOT rejected both proposals. Then in 2017, I was asked to testify at a marathon 4.5-hour hearing before the House Transportation Committee. I'm sure you recall this, after Dr. David Dow was dragged off a full United Airlines flight and beaten bloody. At that hearing, there were 6 witnesses, 5 airline executives and me. While the cameras were on, the dozens of representatives chastised the airline executives for deteriorating levels of customer service. But ultimately, Congress did nothing to strengthen airline involuntary bumping policies. And a short time later, the DOT announced there would be no fine levied against United Airlines for Dr. Dow's mistreatment. Outnumbered 5-1, or outnumbered 18-1. Is there any question that money buys access to the White House and both houses of Congress, regardless of which party is in power? And for the U.S. aviation industry, such influence has increased as the number of players has decreased. Over the years, Boeing's major domestic competitors, such as Douglas, McDonnell, Lockheed, have effectively been eliminated through mergers and acquisitions. And then there is the domestic airline industry. I had a slide I was going to throw up. It showed the number of major airlines in the United States in as recently as 30 years ago, in the late 80s. There were 13 logos up there. Oh, no, it's fine. It just, get the image of, remember Pan Am, TWA, all those names that we remember, Eastern. And then I was going to click to another slide, and that's those 13 airlines. There's 4 major airlines in the United States now. The term major has a specific DOT definition. Not at all. And so that consolidation is what's driving so much of this. I've personally testified against several of these mergers, and my batting average has remained absolutely consistent and unchanged, .000. Delta Northwest, United Continental, American U.S. Airways, Southwest AirTran, Alaska Virgin America. If consumer advocates opposed it, Congress and the White House rubber stamped it. That's through multiple administrations with both parties. But my real education came at one of those airline merger hearings. I arrived at the hearing room and took my seat just minutes before the scheduled start time. Yet there were only empty chairs at my table. Finally, a door opened behind the podium where the senators sat. Think of where a judge comes out of chambers. And out came several of the committee members, accompanied by the same airline executives who would be testifying in opposition, not to me, but to the interests of millions of American travelers and airline employees. They were whispering and joking and laughing and clapping each other on the back. And then finally the airline execs came over to my table, took their seats, and we were all sworn in. I was shocked and horrified, and quite frankly, I felt sick. This wasn't a metaphorical illustration of how money buys access. It was a quite literal illustration. And it was seen by everyone in that hearing room and everyone watching on C-SPAN. I later asked an advocate colleague about it, and he said such pre-hearing access is quite common for corporate executives, though not for consumer advocates. It's worth noting that just 3 days ago, the House Subcommittee on Aviation held a hearing entitled Status of the Boeing 737 MAX Stakeholder Perspectives. There's that word again. The 5 witnesses were representatives from the U.S. Airlines' largest lobbying group, a pilots union, and a flight attendants union, as well as a former FAA administrator who subsequently served as an executive for Southwest Airlines, which of course operates many of the MAX aircraft. The 5th witness was Captain Sully Sullenberger. But there were no advocates for passengers invited. Or families, absolutely. We did as well through my other hat for Consumer Reports, yes. Many consumer advocates make themselves available for these hearings. And yet we're supposed to be shocked that Congress and the FAA allowed Boeing to self-regulate the 737 MAX. In the wake of the Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines tragedies, of course, the whole world has focused attention on how Boeing certifies aircraft and how the Federal Aviation Administration oversees, or rather fails to oversee, such certification. Let's not forget that just until a few years ago, the FAA's mission statement on its website specifically referred to serving its, quote, customers. That term meant the airlines. You really need to let that sort of sink in for a moment. We're talking about a federal agency in the United States, not the American people whom the government serves, the taxpayers who fund that government, the passengers who buy the ticket. This is the open language that is used by the FAA. Now, since then, that language was changed on the mission statement. But insiders at the FAA, and I speak to hundreds of them every year, and the airlines and Boeing, all know that the mindset most definitely has not changed. For those of us who have been following American aviation in recent decades, unfortunately, nothing about the Boeing 737 MAX debacle has been particularly surprising. Tragic, heartbreaking, but not surprising. We have seen this play out time and again with the airlines, particularly with the FAA's oversight of safety, and most particularly with the FAA's oversight of aircraft maintenance. My book, Attention All Passengers, was published in 2012, and yet in some ways it's more relevant now than ever, because rather than describing events 7 years ago, it identified what were then the dangerous airline trend lines about safety, competition, security, and passenger rights. Unfortunately, they've all manifested themselves, and all of these trend lines have gotten worse in the last 7 years. I'd like to read a short section about what I identified at the time as the single greatest threat to airline safety, the FAA's lack of oversight of outsourced aircraft maintenance. 21 fatalities, but nothing major. That's how the airline industry views the one accident that has stood out from all others because it foretold the dangers to come. This crash remains the wake-up call the airlines still refuse to acknowledge. In January 2003, Flight 5481 took off from Charlotte, North Carolina, en route to Greenville, South Carolina. The Beechcraft 1900D, operated by Air Midwest on behalf of U.S. Airways Express, had barely gotten airborne when it stalled and crashed into a U.S. Airways hangar and burst into flames, just 37 seconds after leaving the ground. All 21 persons on board were killed, and 1 person in the hangar was injured. The National Transportation Safety Board determined that the probable cause was the airplane's loss of pitch control during takeoff, which had resulted from the incorrect rigging of the critical elevator control system by an outsourced maintenance contractor, Raytheon Aerospace, in Huntington, West Virginia. In turn, Raytheon had further outsourced some work to unlicensed maintenance contractors. You'll see over time that when we use the term outsourcing, it can mean degrees of up to 5 degrees, to the absurd point of a surfboard shop in California being asked to work on composite materials on board an aircraft. People had never ever worked on aircraft. Incredibly enough, it is not a violation of FAA regulations for such outsourcing. Whose fault was the crash? As it often does, the NTSB cited multiple parties. These included Raytheon, Air Midwest for its lack of oversight of the work being performed at the Huntington Maintenance Station, and the FAA itself for lack of oversight of Air Midwest. So what about U.S. Airways? Well, even though the doomed airplane was painted in that airline's colors, federal authorities are blind to such nuances. This was strictly an Air Midwest tragedy, not a U.S. Airways tragedy. U.S. Airways, of course, has since merged with American Airlines. As airline accident investigations go, this one was fairly routine, inasmuch as such heartache can never become routine. The NTSB wrapped up its findings in little more than a year. But then a funny thing happened. Word got out that some of the family members of the victims, specifically the parents of Christiana Shepard, an 18-year-old college student, had not accepted an offer of settlement from the Air Midwest insurance reps. Instead, the Shepards wanted a public apology. The attorneys conference called, and in a nation where a dollar sign can be affixed to anything or anyone, the airline's lawyers began to get a little frustrated. Just what exactly did these parents want? An apology. No, really, how much? They want an apology. No, come on, give us a figure. That is what they want, an apology. And so it went, on and on. Nearly 4 years after the accident, I spoke to Pastor Douglas Shepard and his wife, Teresa Shepard, for Consumer Reports. The bottom line for these airline companies cannot be money, Christiana's father told me. That has to change. Outsourcing with no oversight leads to loss. It took more than 2 years, but in the end, the Shepards caused an extraordinary event to take place, something unique in U.S. commercial aviation. The head of an airline attended a memorial service, stood before the next of kin, and read a formal and public apology. On May 6, 2005, Greg Stevens, the president of Air Midwest, joined the victims' families at the crash site memorial in Charlotte and uttered these words: "We are truly sorry and regret and apologize to everyone affected by this tragic event." In the interim, the outsourced maintenance company had, you guessed it, changed its name from Raytheon Aerospace to Vertex Aerospace. But even that new entity was invoked by Stevens in his remarks. Air Midwest and its maintenance provider, Vertex, acknowledged deficiencies, which together with the wording of the manuals, contributed to this accident. Obviously, much credit goes to the Shepards for making this happen, and credit where it's due to Air Midwest for breaking the nearly century-old tradition of airlines invoking a virtual curtain of silence after a tragedy. But a few qualifications are required. Soon after the apology, Vertex Aerospace changed its name again, this time to L3 Communications Aerotech. Then Air Midwest was shut down by its parent company, Mesa Air Group, in 2008. And despite the eloquence of Stevens' apology, at no time did he mention the airline whose name was emblazoned on the side of the defective plane, U.S. Airways, which, as I noted, of course, now flies as American Airlines. Earlier this month, Ralph joined me at the National Press Club in Washington so that we could have a public discussion about airline safety and this concept of regulatory capture that is textbook at the FAA. That summit was sponsored by the Business Travel Coalition and the Transport Workers Union, which represents maintenance personnel at American Airlines. Several members of the TWU are here today. We unveiled a document called the Airline Passenger Safety Bill of Rights, which would provide transparency and oversight for maintenance outsourcing, particularly overseas. What most people don't understand is that every airline in the United States now outsources what the industry refers to as heavy maintenance, and much of the line maintenance and lesser maintenance is done here in the United States. Much of it is done outside the United States now: El Salvador, Brazil, Mexico, Singapore, China. And it creates myriad problems about safety, about security, the loss of U.S. jobs, and most important, the lack of FAA oversight. My final question to Ralph that day was one I've been struggling with myself for some time now. When you're fighting against corporations with such deep pockets, how do you stay motivated to continue the fight? Ralph responded, "You have a passion for justice." That lack of access to the corridors of power that I spoke of, well, there have been some notable exceptions in recent years, occasions in which safety advocates have been front and center. But tragically, in all these cases, such access has been earned through the highest sacrifice imaginable by those who survived airline disasters or by the loved ones of those who perished. I personally have gotten to know some of these courageous and passionate people in recent years. People who have taken on Congress and the FAA, the federal agency known widely throughout the industry and its own employee ranks as the, quote, tombstone agency. It's a nickname that refers to the FAA's tendency to act on known safety problems only after there has been loss of life. We saw it quite dramatically just last year, in April 2018, when a woman named Jennifer Reardon was killed on Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 over Philadelphia after she was nearly sucked out of a Boeing 737 because an uncontained engine failure ripped a hole in the fuselage. Just 3 days later, the FAA issued Emergency Airworthiness Directive 2018-09-51, requiring ultrasonic inspections of the faulty engine fan blades. So it was a quick response, no? Actually, no. In fact, an eerie but nearly identical failure of the same engine type, CFM 56-7, on the same aircraft type, Boeing 737, on the same airline, Southwest Airlines, occurred in flight nearly 2 years earlier, in August 2016. Only in that case, the engine shrapnel did not puncture a hole in the fuselage, and thankfully no one was injured or killed. So, the FAA dragged its feet for 20 months while it effectively asked the airlines, including Southwest, to weigh in on establishing their own timetables for inspecting the faulty blades. In recent years, I've met and even befriended numerous government and corporate whistleblowers, incredibly brave men and women who have risked everything to protect the flying public. And I've gotten to know some individuals whom I truly believe are heroes, a word I hardly ever use. They include the following: the families of those killed on board Colgan Air Flight 3408 in Buffalo in 2009, tireless fighters who have journeyed to Washington time and again to strengthen commercial piloting standards, particularly at the ubiquitous regional airlines that are outsourced operators for the major carriers. Conversely, the airline industry continues fighting to weaken those piloting standards, so the Colgan families can never truly claim victory and move on. And of course, there was the Shepard family that I just referenced. They lost their daughter in 2003 on board U.S. Airways Flight 5481. Rick, could you help me with this? It's falling. It's falling. They have been outspoken in advocating for stricter oversight of outsourced aircraft maintenance. Thank you. And then there's Jan Brown, the flight attendant who survived the fatal crash of United Airlines Flight 232 in Iowa in 1989. She was forced to tell the mother of a lap child to place her baby on the floor of the cabin as per standard emergency procedures during such a crisis. Then subsequently, she had to tell that same mother the child had been killed, even though that death would have been entirely preventable had the child been properly restrained. Over the years, Jan Brown has become one of the most vocal critics of the FAA's policy of allowing children under 2 to fly unrestrained on board commercial aircraft, even though every state in the union has a child restraint law for automobiles, vehicles that travel at about 1/10 the speed of commercial jets. These and many other individuals humble us all in their passion for justice after experiencing such loss. And now, of course, we have Samya and the other lives lost on Ethiopian Flight 302 and Lion Air Flight 610. A total of 346 deaths in the span of just several months. We're all here today to seek ways to prevent similar tragedies from occurring. But it should not take such profound heartache for safety advocates to earn a seat before Congress or the DOT or the FAA or the White House. And yet time and again it has. All of us in this room wish we didn't have to be here today. But once again, tragedy is forcing a tone-deaf aviation industry and an indifferent Federal Aviation Administration to respond in the face of intense public scrutiny and media attention. These preventable deaths were horribly tragic, but at the very least, we should seek to find ways to prevent them from being repeated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill McGee. At this point, I'd just like to pay tribute to the workers in the airline industry, because it's often said that the safety record is due to how brilliantly the aircrafts are designed for redundancy and reliability. And for many years, Boeing engineers made some pretty brilliant decisions when they were allowed to make the decisions and not be overruled by an otherwise preoccupied with profits management. But just think of the daily flights and the weather and all the uncertainties, and consider the excellence of the pilots, the flight attendants, the mechanics, and the airline traffic controllers. Just consider how many decisions they have to make every day and how they cannot make one wrong decision without a serious consequence. And we don't want these people to be sidelined, marginalized, and taken over by automated intelligence, which is often afflicted with time bomb software, as was the case with the Boeing 737 MAX. Put yourself in the place of pilots in the Indonesian Airlines. They didn't even know the software was on the plane. And they start taking off, and the plane's nose goes down, and they manually put it up again. 21 times the time bomb software pushed that nose down toward the Java Sea. 21 times they tried to override it with both pilots using all their strength, and then they could no longer do it. And it hit the sea at 550 miles an hour. So Boeing and their henchmen in Congress are trying to blame pilots. As Captain Sullenberger, who landed that plane in the Hudson River and became a hero and the subject of a movie, testified 3 days ago at the House Transportation Committee. He says, we shouldn't be in the business of blaming dead pilots. Pilots who are overcome by software they didn't even know, or if they do knew it, they weren't trained, it wasn't in the training manual, and it miscued. And it was a single point of attack. The Airbus 320neo has 3 sensors, and this Boeing plane had 1 operational sensor, violating every Boeing engineer's knowledge about the necessity for redundancy. So I want to thank the Transport Union who sponsored that meeting a few days ago that Bill was talking about at the National Press Club. Before we have an opportunity for discussion, and I think, Rick, you wanted to have some questions from the audience, I'd just like to put this whole issue of tort law in a little broader context. Our founding fathers fought for tort law. The second major objection they had to King George, remember that famous petition to King George III? The first one was no taxation without representation. You know what the second one was? Don't you dare take away our right of trial by jury. That's how important that was as a bastion against monarchical tyranny by King George III and his Tory representatives. How many times do we hear about that when we're kids in school, pledging allegiance to the flag that ends with liberty and justice for all? We never hear about it. Our children are put through 12 years of schooling, and they cannot answer the question, what is tort law? And let me give you an illustration. Let me give you an illustration of the total scope of this magnificent tool in the hands of wrongfully injured people seeking justice or their next of kin. 99% of wrongfully injured people in our country never use tort law. They don't know about it. If they did, they think it's something shameful to file a lawsuit. It's a bizarre cultural trait of a land of the free, home of the brave. I've never been able to understand it. Or they don't know how to get a lawyer. They think they have to pay the lawyer by the hour when they don't. It's the only area of our law where you have a contingent fee, where the lawyers collect only if they win for you. And they fear going into court and being subjected to examination, or they fear being slandered or subject to invasion of their privacy. There are a lot of objections. And on top of it, it's the whole movement by the corporations to weaken tort law, to restrict the autonomy of the jury, to put forth all kinds of procedural obstacles to lawyers, to give you your right to have your day in court and trial by jury. As a result, jury trials are declining in our country. Verdicts are declining. The number of trials are declining. And yet, what do we hear on the mass media? We hear that we're a litigious society, when the record shows that people in 1840 filed more lawsuits per capita than they do today, by far, in 1840, or the 19th century. And then we hear of all these frivolous suits, and as Rick points out, he asks all these lawyers who come here and say, what frivolous suits? And he asks some of the people he tours, he said, do you know of a frivolous suit? Judges dismiss frivolous suits on a motion to dismiss. Bingo. They're in charge of the courtroom. And I'm sorry to say, more of them are favoring corporations than their victims. They're very quick to dismiss frivolous suits. If lawyers take too many attempts at frivolous suits, they lose their reputation and lose their opportunity to win in court. This is what happens when we don't have an educational system that deals with the greatest tool that we have to achieve justice in America without asking permission of anybody. That's why the civil justice system and tort law is considered central to self-government. Because unlike other areas where we're trying to get some justice from the legislature or the executive branch agencies, state and federal or local, you don't have to ask anybody's permission. That's why tort law is called one of the pillars of our democracy. Because all you have to do is find a contingent fee lawyer and go to court. You also have a greater measure of equality in anything else you do in life, because the courts are under rules that allow you to take on the most powerful corporate executive and the most powerful corporations in the land in a court of law where they can't buy the juries. And if they try to bribe the judges, they're in deep trouble. Unlike what they can do to our lawmakers, right? With campaign contributions. Just consider, if you will, the exhibits in this museum, and consider the number of people affected by the reasons why the judges supported the wrongfully injured. You have the tobacco exhibit. Years and years after 40 million Americans died from tobacco-related diseases, some courts began to hold the tobacco companies liable. Very few of tobacco smokers got justice. You say, well, it's their own fault. But what these lawsuits disclosed to us was that tobacco companies for years told everybody that tobacco was good for them. It was good flavor. It helped them concentrate in their work. And it relieved their anxiety. And it was safe. They said it in their ads. They said it everywhere. They lied to people. They didn't say what the truth was, which was that it causes cancer and a variety of other diseases. They didn't say that they tried to hook 10-year-olds by handing out free packages of cigarettes in front of middle school and then later high school, to hook them early, because their studies showed if you hook them early, you got them for life. They marketed addiction with the latest psychological manipulative insights known to them. 30 to 40 million people. There are exhibits on automobiles out there. 2.5 million Americans were killed in auto crashes since 1910. Hundreds of millions injured. Because they weren't given simple protections like padded dash panels, which were known to the manufacturers of ancient Roman chariots over 2,000 years ago. Enough lead time for General Motors, wouldn't you think? For the lack of seatbelts, which didn't come into standard equipment until the late 1960s. Seatbelts were used by pilots in World War I planes to keep from falling out of the planes. They knew how to put seatbelts in cars to keep you from going through a windshield. For the lack of collapsible steering columns so they're not spears and low collisions in the heart and chest of the driver. For decent brakes and handling. That's what those cases represent. Millions and millions of preventable casualties they finally tell us about because the lawmakers wouldn't do their job. These exhibits represent the tragedies of industrial society that were allowed because the few made the decisions for the many. There's an exhibit on asbestos, which the asbestos manufacturers knew caused cancer, but they still used it and distributed it everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of workers died because of asbestos fibers producing the most painful termination, such as mesothelioma. Lawsuits broke that open too. It wasn't the lawmakers taking money from companies. It wasn't the executive branch. The lawsuits, again and again, are the first responders. They're the ones who blow open the secrecy. They're the ones who get compensatory justice for the aggrieved and wounded. Those are the ones who tell you about the alerts so you can help defend yourself against a bad consumer product or a bad hospital practice. They're the ones who deter other manufacturers from doing the same thing because they're hitting the pocketbook. And it's these lawsuits that are degraded, slandered, libeled in a swirl of propaganda that has literally persuaded 70% of the American people that there are too many lawsuits and they're too frivolous. Massive lies. And when Justice Stephen Breyer came here of the Supreme Court, and he looked at every exhibit, he's very meticulous, he came out and he called this museum, quote, an excellent educational institution, unquote. This museum, in a way, is emblematic of the failures of industry and government and the occasional restoration of justice brought about by a lone, wrongfully injured human being who goes to a lone contingent fee lawyer, who go to a lone court with a judge and trial by jury. The most humble beginnings of these magnificent demonstrations of judicial justice start in just that way, that one wrongfully injured person says to herself or himself, I'm not going to take it lying down. The whole asbestos litigation, and there's no more asbestos with very few exceptions in the U.S. anymore. Asbestos is not going to kill any more people, except people already infected by it. It's been essentially banned by the law, stimulated by a few cases. Started in a little town called Tyler, Texas. One worker, near death, one lawyer, one judge, one jury. How can we not be proud of that? How can we not be proud that we have the best civil justice system in the world and it's being degraded by corporations and their propaganda and their political allies. And out of this little town, Winsted, right near the Naugatuck Valley where a good chunk of the Industrial Revolution started, used to be the brass capital of the world, Waterbury. A lot of industrial injuries and fatalities. Out of this little town is the only law museum in the world. Never mind the only tort museum in the world. And a small number of people made it happen. And everyone who goes through this museum, no matter how they entered it, with skepticism, with Aetna-propelled propaganda, with insensitivity to wrongfully injured people because they think it'll never happen to them, come out of this museum transformed because it respects their intelligence. It asks them questions that make them reflective about each case. It provides them with the history of judicial decisions, refereed in open court, unlike a lot of government secrecy, appealed in open court, open to anybody who wants to walk in, open to the media. Is there any other government decision that's so refereed and open to the public? I doubt it. And out of this town, we hope there'll be a major expansion of education. We hope to build a consumer boycott of the Boeing 737 MAX because of all the investigations that Mike Stumo listed in Washington. They can all be politically recalled by politically influential companies. They can be diminished. They can be delayed. But what can't be delayed are the lawsuits under tort law, that private pillar of justice in our country. And what can't be stopped is a consumer boycott by people who will say to the airlines, we don't want to fly this plane. Do you have another plane? When that brand, that MAX, is stigmatized, Boeing loses value. They pay attention to that. You know how much money they put into branding, don't you? They pay attention to that. And it's nothing anybody can stop us from doing every time we fly. We just ask the reservation person, what's the equipment? What kind of plane? And then the reservation person calls up the superior, says, we're getting this kind of feedback. And they call up the airline. The airline calls up Boeing. That's assuming that plane will ever fly again. But that plane should never fly again. And if you want to join in solidarity with the families and with other people who want to do something about this situation, here's a button out there on your way out. It's called Axe the Max. It's a discussion starter. It gets you to find out more about it. And believe me, there are a lot of major hazards in our world. If you overcome one, you're helping to overcome a lot of the others that have never been discussed here today. I'd like to make one more plea for respecting jury duty. How many of you have gotten noticed for jury duty? Okay, here's what the studies show. Oh, I got a notice for jury duty. What a pain in the neck. How do I get out of it? It's so bad in Washington, D.C. 70% of the summons are thrown away. And there's no enforcement because there's no budget to enforce showing up. I learned about this because I kept getting jury notices I said, what am I doing getting a jury notice every 2 years? There are a lot of people in Washington, D.C. That's because most people throw them away. I've never had the privilege of serving on a jury. They always strike me for some bizarre reason. It's an experience, I'm told, of a lifetime. People who go into a jury box grumbling about what an irritation and a distraction it is, come out holding their heads high. And they'll say it's one of the best experiences of their life. Well, why wouldn't it be? When else are they given such power to bring to heel? ExxonMobil, Pfizer, General Motors, Walmart, Bank of America. And that's why it's so important to study in high school and middle school, the civil justice service. It's the essence of self-governance. We talk a lot about self-government, and we say, when do we ever see it? Have you ever cited self-government? It's the jury system, to start with. There are many ways you can elaborate your knowledge on this besides here in the museum. And the materials out in the bookstore, which Rick will mention, are attempts to substitute for our lack of education in high school and college. It's an attempt to give us material where we can have communicative sessions with our friends, neighbors, and co-workers. As human interest cases where we can see the valiant role of families of the victims, the valiant roles of workers who help make workplace safety better, who help make the marketplace safety, who help send the signal that it's cheaper to be safe by corporations than to injure people, because they're going to be able to make you pay in a court of law. I'd like to suggest that those of you who want to enlist in this effort on the Boeing 737 MAX can speak with Nadia and Mike afterwards, and you can join the really only operational significant airline passenger group, if you'd like, by going to flyersrights.org. flyersrights.org. Keep up to date on the whole Boeing situation and a lot of other things about how you're gouged as a consumer and how you're squeezed in seats where you have no room for your legs to circulate.
Flyers Rights is run by
and Flyers Rights, as I was going to say, the reason why Flyers Rights is run is because Paul Hudson has been at it for 30 years since his daughter was killed at age 16 over Scotland in the Pan Am explosion. And he's never stopped since. But he wonders how long he can keep doing this unless airline passengers give him help. So go to flyersrights.org. Rick, do you want to make some concluding remarks? And also, I'm sure people will have some comments and questions here. Thank you very much, everybody.
I do have a few closing remarks. First of all, I'd like to profoundly thank all of our speakers today. Bill McGee has been a voice in the wilderness fighting for airline safety for years. He's intelligent, learned, articulate. He's a tremendous friend and tremendous ally. Thank you very much. Joan Claybrook. Such a noble, I don't want to get choked up, such a noble spirit, such a generous act to continue with a tremendous career of fighting for consumer safety. Thank you very much. Claire, that was a lovely letter that you read. Mike and Nadia, your courage, your passion, your heart, your energy inspires all of us. Thank you. And of course, I want to thank Senator Blumenthal for coming here on a Saturday and taking the time to speak. And I trust that he will continue to lead this fight. And you have a voice. Reach out to him. Continue to encourage him to lead this fight. And finally, of course, I do want to thank Ralph Nader, founder of this museum, tremendous consumer advocate, a voice of intelligence, integrity, compassion, a tremendous leader for our time, and we are honored to have him. And then I want to say one more brief remark. Every victim of a tort is an amateur. No one trains to be killed or victimized by malpractice or dangerous products. They are people like us, amateurs, thrust into worlds of horror. The tort system, as Ralph just so eloquently put it, is a way to not only fight for justice for them, but to deter injuries to other people. This is my segue into inviting you to do two things. One, we're open till 5, so please do take time. Look around this museum. There's nothing else like it in the country, maybe nothing like it in the world. And two, please stop into the museum store. There are books in there about real people who have been really injured and how the law worked to help them seek justice. It's a tremendous law library, and I encourage all of you to go in there. Read these books, educate yourself, become a voice for all of us. Thank you all very much for coming today. It's been an honor to have you. Thank you. Oh yes, Nadia is great. Bill McGee will have books. He'll be out there signing them. Great book. Find Bill. Talk to him. Good. Thank you again.